Pope Francis was buried this afternoon in the unadorned tomb he had requested at the Basilica of Santa Maria Maggiore in central Rome. His funeral in the Vatican heard calls for his legacy of caring for migrants, the downtrodden and the environment to be kept alive, saying the Pope had always sought to build bridges, not walls.
A wonderful testimony of humanity and a holy life. Those the words of a summary of Pope Francis' papacy, written in Latin and placed in his coffin. It was a judgment shared by presidents and pilgrims gathered in St. Peter's Square this morning to bid farewell. Among them, President Michael D. Higgins and the Taoiseach and Taoiseach. The global political changes over the course of Pope Francis' 12-year papacy writ large in the array of world leaders present. The tens of thousands who lined the cobbled streets around the square, a testament to the Pope's bond with the people. It was a simpler and shorter requiem mass than previous papal funerals, in keeping with the pontiff's wishes. The homily exhorting the pontiff's mission.
Faced with the raging wars of recent years, with their inhuman horrors and countless deaths and destruction, Pope Francis incessantly raised his voice, imploring for peace and calling for reason and honest negotiation to find possible solutions. War always leaves the world worse than it was before. It is always a painful and tragic defeat for everyone. Build bridges, not walls, was an exhortation he repeated many times.
A message welcomed by the crowd. The final journey to his final resting place outside the Vatican. Once again among the people. As Rome came to a standstill for its Pope and its Bishop. Greeted at the Basilica of St. Mary Major by a group of the homeless he sought to help. His burial, simple and unadorned, like the tomb Pope Francis requested. Made with marble from Italy's Liguria region, the land of his grandparents. From tomorrow, the public will be able to visit Pope Francis' tomb. And talk will turn to who will succeed him. Fiona Mitchell, RTE News, Rome.
Well, I'm joined now by RT's religion correspondent Alva Connealy. Alva, as we heard there in Fiona's report, that theme, building bridges, not walls, it really was echoed again and again today.
Yeah, and in the homily, Cardinal Battista Re, he spoke about, solving conflicts and creating peace. And I guess, when you have worldwide leaders at the Vatican for this event on this day, you can understand why he went there. Now, confirmation came during the ceremony that Vladimir Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, and the US President Donald Trump had met prior to the funeral mass in St. Peter's Basilica. And then further confirmation of that meeting through a photo of the two men in the Basilica before they went out to St. Peter's Square. And I think that some people questioned, well, is this fair that this becomes a major news story? Because it did on the day that Pope Francis's funeral and burial is taking place. And I think the general consensus is that Pope Francis would have been quite happy that the two men meet and that discussions take place. That was the type of man he was. And another thing brought up in the homily about him as a man and his character was that he raised the migrant crisis, and the fact that there were so many world leaders there and the migrant crisis is such an issue. This was raised also by Cardinal Ray, and he pointed out that Pope Francis visited Lampedusa in the Mediterranean at the height of that migrant crisis, and this received a round of applause. And there was also points made in terms of, the future of the church following Francis, that pastoral outlook and bending down to everyone. And remember that in that congregation are cardinals that will be voting in a conclave and thinking about the future of the church.
OK, Alva Connealy, thank you so much for that. We'll have more on that Zelensky-Trump meeting later, and indeed more about the conclave to come. Meanwhile, hundreds of thousands of people packed St. Peter's Square in the Vatican and lined the streets of Rome for the funeral of Pope Francis. Mourners flocked from all over the world to bid him farewell.
Before the sun had fully risen, the faithful began arriving in St. Peter's Square. Security was tight as an estimated 400,000 mourners gathered in Rome to pay their respects, along with leaders and dignitaries from all over the world.
It's a particular honour to be here as Taoiseach with the President of Ireland, and indeed the Taoiseach to represent the government and the people of Ireland in recognition of the relationship between Ireland and the Vatican and the many common issues that we worked on together, particularly in terms of climate, conduct of foreign policy, human rights, and his very strong and fearless stance on war and conflict.
Pope Francis was and will remain an incredible source of hope, and that was in the message at the beginning of last year. He mentioned about a diplomacy of hope.
Crowds lined the streets as the funeral cortege travelled from the Vatican to St. Mary's Major's Basilica, the Pope's chosen burial place. Catholics had travelled from all over the world for the funeral, including Ireland.
It's a big journey, but it's a historic event, and I feel it's a privilege to be able to come.
It's here for the canonisation tomorrow, so we're here for the funeral instead.
So many young people, which is such a blessing. We need the young people to come back into Catholic Church, so it's brilliant to see all the young ones here.
While the funeral ceremonies have now concluded, some crowds remain at the Pope's final resting place this evening in quiet prayer. Joan O'Sullivan, RT News.
Well, joining me now is McCarthy, a former journalist with Vatican Radio, who now works with the Pontifical Commission for the Protection of Minors. Thanks so much for joining us again. You were with us last night. What did you make of today's ceremony?
Today was a day, I think, when Rome said goodbye to its bishop, Catholics said goodbye to their Pope, and I think the world said goodbye to a man that they recognised as a leader of the past 12 years, from some very turbulent times and in a very changing society. I was watching the cortege part with my children, listening to the comments of the Romans as the Pope's coffin passed by in his Pope mobile, which is so fitting because that was the vehicle, of course, which he used every single Wednesday to tour the square and greet the faithful, the ordinary faithful who'd come, and even tourists, just curious tourists who'd come for his Wednesday audiences. And, often he has described Rome as chaotic. I think in his last meeting with the mayor of Rome, he said it's a very difficult city for people to live in. And often people have described Romans as chaotic. But today they really put on their best show as a tribute to this man whom was, although Argentinian, they felt very much part of their city.
And Romans always feel that about a pope, don't they, in general, but particularly, I think, with Francis.
Absolutely. They're very, very territorial. And there's no doubt about it that he won their heart when he came out on the balcony that evening, saying in his Italian, heavily accented Italian, "Pray for me, I am your bishop," first and foremost. And that was a big part of his pontificate all along, the fact that he was a bishop, a pastor.
And the fact that Romans were able to line the streets like that, many of them wouldn't have been able to get into St. Peter's Square because obviously there's a limit on numbers. The fact that they were able to do that was because he decided, unlike every pope for the last 120 years, he wasn't going to be buried in St. Peter's. He wanted to go to Santa Maria Maggiore.
Again, underlining this link that he has had with the city and his visual understanding of how important important symbols are for the people of Rome. That icon, Salus Populi Romani, which is saviour of the Roman people, the tradition has it that that icon was marched to the streets of Rome in medieval times when there was the plague, and it was thanks to the intercession of Our Lady in this icon that Rome and Romans were saved. And it's always been housed in this basilica, which is one of the oldest churches dedicated to the Virgin Mary, the Mother of Christ, in the world. And of course, therefore, the Pope's paternal devotion linked to his dear love for his role as Bishop of Rome. And he said one last meeting with the faithful, bathed in the faithful, travelling through the ancient city to this basilica. It really was a very touching moment for Romans, and they appreciated it.
OK, now, inevitably, Rome has said, and the world has said goodbye to Francis. Attention will turn to what happens next.
Yes, well, we have a period, a diaphragm period, between the burial of a pope and the election of another pope. For Catholics and for people who are of Christian faith worldwide, this is the period of mourning. The Latin term is Novem Dialis, which basically means 9 days of mourning. Every single day a Mass will be celebrated in suffrage for the repose of the soul of the Holy Father, the Pope, but also, and perhaps more importantly, during those 9 days, in a hall just to the left of the dome of St. Peter's Basilica called the Paul VI Synod Hall, the cardinals, all 250 of the cardinals from the College of Cardinals, will gather every single day to meet and to discern and to talk about the challenges that face the Church internally within its own life, and also the Church in the world externally. This is a very important moment because, as we were saying last night, Francis has appointed 109 of these cardinals, some of them from countries that have never had a cardinal before. So these men are coming to Rome and they don't know how you elect a pope. They literally have to be taught. They've never done it before. And there are a series of rules that govern how a pope is elected. And of course, perhaps even more importantly, they don't know each other. How do they choose a man from among them if they don't even know many of the other people that they're joining in this hall? These general congregations give the men the opportunity not only to discuss and discern those challenges, but also to begin tracing the profile of what kind of person the man who's going to take up the leadership of the Catholic Church, the Universal Catholic Church, must have. What are the qualities they would like to see in their next leader? These are essential days. So even though it might seem like a quiet period to people outside the Church, these are fundamental days for people, within the Catholic Church.
Is this effectively drawing up a job spec?
Yeah. Well, yeah. I think for people who have faith, it's a little bit more important. We like to believe that, the Holy Spirit is there as well. But yes, it is. It's drawing up the profile of the man who's going to govern 1.4 billion Catholics worldwide and their spiritual life.
And you use the phrase discernment of the problems facing the Church, the problems facing the world, and exactly what sort of a candidate might face those problems. So we don't know, obviously, what that list of problems will be, but what are some of the things that occur to you that will be on in the in tray of the new Pope?
Well, of course, one of the rules governing the election of a pope is that the cardinals cannot speak about what is discussed within these congregations externally. Generally, these the subjects that really concern the most, emerge after the actual conclave itself. So I do believe we will hear in the future following the election of a pope. But I would imagine that internally within the life of the Church, the fact that it's a very different Church. Francis has left us with a very different Church. It's no longer Eurocentric. It's very much a global Church. We now have seen the importance of Asia and Africa. They're coming to the fore. They are different types of church to the European Church. So there is tension there. Africa and Asia would be very socially liberal churches, but doctrinally a little bit more conservative. It's the opposite, perhaps, in the Anglophone sphere or even in Europe itself. So those dynamics, I think, maybe come into play. But also the challenges that face us in the world. I think one of the biggest concerns that's going to emerge is young people. I have to be honest. It's a radically different reality. These are young people who live their lives not only in the reality that we know, but also in a virtual reality. How does the Church, minister to them? Does the Church understand their reality, the mental pressures, the social pressures, how this, duality changes social demographics, and how does the Church fit into that? I would really see that as well. On a geopolitical level, I think it's obvious to everyone what those challenges are, and we heard it today, and we saw it today in that photograph, which was the photograph of the day.
Well, I'm joined here in Rome by Bishop Paul Tighe of the Dicastery for Culture and Education here in the Vatican. Thank you very much indeed for joining us, Bishop. You had a ringside seat earlier on. It was a very dignified, a very solemn, a very moving ceremony, really, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was dignified, solemn, moving, and I thought joyful. There was a lovely sense of a celebration of the completeness of what Pope Francis did. And I thought there was a great warmth from the crowd, particularly in responding as Cardinal Ray, who, you know, is very much the pragmatic wing of the Curia, who's been around forever, gave a thoroughly warm endorsement of the politics and the views and the values of Pope Francis. And then the response of the crowd, the warmth of that, as Lampedusa was mentioned, as peace was mentioned, it was just, I thought, a very fitting conclusion to what was a remarkable number of years. Cardinal
Ray, in his homily, he had messages perhaps for the politicians in the crowd, the statesmen, in terms of, as you mentioned, migration and conflict resolution and so on. Messages too, perhaps, for the College of Cardinals, who will be making very important decisions in the next few weeks. Yeah, no, I thought the earlier part where he was talking about what Pope Francis had done in terms of the Church, of opening the Church up. The Church is not just a club for the entitled or for those who have earned it. Pope Francis always had this idea that the Church is a field hospital where people have need, where they feel the need for healing, where they feel to be welcomed, that's what the Church should be. And that, I think, is something Pope Francis has done. He's changed the notion of the Church from being people like myself who work in an institution. We're trying to think in institutional terms. He wants to get back to the community, to the heart and to the values that are at the heart of being Church. Of kind of, if we are people of faith and we're lucky enough to know that God loves us, to try and share that good news with other people by supporting them and helping them. Any organisation, any bureaucracy, it takes time to change, doesn't it? How much did Francis change the Curia, do you think? I think he did two changes. He did a fair few structural changes, and they were important. But very early on in his pontificacy, he spent time on kind of giving a little series of sermons for people who worked in the Vatican, which he reminded us that it was in a sense a privilege to be working here and that it's a job of service. And then he had this famous notice on his own office door which says, no complaints. People are coming in. He didn't want them to come in and be complaining and whining. Get at the work, enjoy it and give yourself to it and avoid anything of the old martyr complex. I think he was changing the hearts and minds of people who work in the Curia. Did it work? I think for most, hopefully for many it did, yes. A lot of people have spoken about his simplicity. I mean, there was this thing about going to settle up his own bill in the guest house he was staying after he was elected Pope, and that obviously was innate to him because he's been like that. He was like that all his life. But there was also a message, I suppose, for people in Rome, in the Curia, for higher ups in the Church, that this is a new system. This is a new way of looking at things, and also an indication that he didn't want to be managed by officialdom. Absolutely. I mean, there was the issue of the simplicity, even his choice to live in Santa Marta, which was a choice to live in a simpler place. But it was also a choice to live in a place where he was less controlled. It was very close to one of the exits. He could have people in and out as he needed them, and the machine was not going to know who was coming and tell him who could or could not come. I think one of the great things he did was he maintained his own autonomy, he maintained his own vision, and as I say, the simplicity too then was a very concrete gesture to others. Yeah. So, as I say, big decisions coming up for the College of Cardinals. Only a fool would try and forecast the results of that. It's a process that will be taken very, very seriously and will take some time to go through. What would you like to see in terms of the pontiff? Not the individual, obviously, but the qualities that a new pontiff would bring. I would like to see a pope again who has a focus on what's happening in the world, with a kind of a focus on particularly the main problems of our world, problems of inequality, problems of polarization, and somebody who would pick up some of the themes that Pope Francis had launched, particularly one that got mentioned there today, the culture of encounter. We live in a world which we're all very different religions, different cultures, different traditions, different economic backgrounds. Pope Francis wanted to make of that world a family, brothers and sisters all, and we do that by seeing in the person who's different to us not a threat, not an enemy, not competition, but another person who has their own unique dignity. And we learn to see beyond the superficial differences and see the goodness
and see the humanity at the heart of all people.
And that explains his drive to reach out to other religions, as well as his drive to reach out to the marginalised in society, I suppose.
Absolutely. It was clear, particularly on the religious side, he did famous dialogue and statement of together declaration with the Islamic traditions, trying to find the core values. Then particularly with those maybe who even ideologically might have been seen to be a bit different. You know, he wanted to encourage people who he felt were working for the good of humanity. We had two kind of strange events where he brought artists together, he brought comedians together, because he said there are people who are doing good in our world and celebrating unlikely heroes maybe.